Welcome to a new module, M115, and this deals with programming in the Swift programming language. So in this part, I just take you through what are some of the requirements that you need in order to start programming in Swift. So a brief introduction. So what do you need? What are the programming requirements? You need the tools, and in subsequent parts to this lesson I'll show you how to get the tools. You need to learn how to program in a particular language, and the language we will be using is Swift. You also need to know what a framework is, and I'll explain that later, and what operating systems you need on your Mac computer that you're going to use for development, and what operating system or version of the operating system you need on your iOS devices. So let's start off with the tools. What tools do you need? You firstly need Xcode, and I'll show you later how to download Xcode from the Mac App Store. Once you've downloaded Xcode, it comes with three other tools. One's called the simulator, which allows you to run a program on a software version of a hardware device. So if you don't have an iPhone or an iPad and you want to quickly test your program, you could use the simulator. There's another tool called instruments, which helps you to make sure that your code is optimized and not using too much of memory or not using too much of processor cycles. So it can detect what parts of your program needs to be optimized. That's called instruments. Then we have an exciting new feature in the new version of Xcode. This is called Playgrounds, where you can quickly simulate or prototype your program. Once you've got the tools, you now need to learn a programming language. In the past, you had to learn a program called Objective-C, which was a bit difficult to learn, especially if you're a new programmer. And last year, Apple has released a new programming language called Swift that supersedes Objective-C, and it's much easier to learn. Now, you don't need to learn Objective-C first and then move along to Swift. Like most of you, you are new programmers, you go directly into Swift. But there is another programming language called Objective-C. And in Xcode, if you know Objective-C and you know Swift, you can mix the two programming languages together. Let me give you a brief history or timeline of how did we get to the Swift programming language. In the old days, we used to program in C. For some of you engineers out there, that was the language for engineers. It was called the C programming language. It was a procedural language. What do I mean by procedural? The program would start executing from statement number 1 right up to the last statement in sequential fashion. That's what we call a procedural programming language. Then later on, a new programming paradigm called OOP, or object-oriented programming, was developed, and then OOP was added on to C, and it then became Objective-C. So Objective-C is a combination of C plus OOP layer added onto it. Also, C++ is another implementation of OOP that's added on to C. So C with OOP is also called C++. So Objective-C and C++ are just object-oriented layers added onto the C programming language. So Objective-C and C++ are two separate programming languages, but both of them incorporate OOP. Then Apple eventually decided that they would like to take care of the development of Objective-C, so they exclusively licensed Objective-C and developed some libraries or frameworks that was added onto Objective-C. Once these libraries or frameworks were added onto Objective-C, they made two versions. One version to run on the Mac computers, or desktop or laptop Mac computers, and that was called Cocoa, and another version of Objective-C to run on iOS devices, on iPhones and iPads, and that version was called Cocoa Touch. So we've had this right up to 2014, mid-2014. And then mid-2014, around about June or July, Apple introduces the Swift programming language, which is based on Objective-C, based on C++, based on C, but a totally new language, as I said, targeting new programmers or people that are programming for the first time. And in Xcode, when you write in a particular programming language, you can mix Objective-C and Swift code together. Now, what are some of the benefits of Swift compared to Objective-C? Well, it's friendlier to new programmers like some of you just getting into programming for the first time. It's easier to read a program that was written in Swift and easier to maintain the program. What do we mean by maintain? Once you've written the program and you want to make some changes to the program, it's easier to make those changes in Swift. It's more concise and cleaner in its syntax. So the keywords or the identifiers that you use in this language, it's much cleaner and concise. And there are no pointers. Now, those of you that are experienced programmers that have been programming in Objective-C know that it was really painful to program in Objective-C because they had a whole lot of things called pointers. When you create new objects, you would create pointers to these objects, which were quite difficult for new programmers. With Swift, there are no pointers involved. Swift also has another feature called interactive playgrounds, which is a simple and fun way to test your program or create prototypes. A prototype is a first program you use to test things out, and then you start developing your program from this initial program called a prototype. Also, apps are compiled faster. What do we mean by compile? The computer or your device is dumb. It doesn't understand Swift or Objective-C or the language that you're programming in. That program needs to be compiled, changed into ones and zeros or binary. So this process of changing your program into ones and zeros or binary is called compilation, or you have to compile it. Also, a benefit of Swift is that when the program runs eventually on your iPhone or iPad, it runs much faster. It's more interactive. The user gets a better experience, so Swift runs faster. It's also designed for safety, so it's less prone to any errors. If you type in something wrong, it will give you error messages, thus preventing bugs from entering your program. Swift, that was the Swift programming language. The third thing that you need to know about in order to start programming is this thing called frameworks. Now, a framework is a collection of classes. And here are some examples. WatchKit, you need to have this framework if you want to develop for the Apple Watch. HealthKit, if you want to develop apps for fitness and health-related apps. And HomeKit, if you want to start talking to your devices at home and getting them to interact with each other. Now, those of you not familiar with object-oriented programming, we have this concept called objects, and they represent real-world things. So, for example, I have car. I have 3 cars. Those are objects. They represent real-world things. But before I can build this car or cars, I need a blueprint. I need the specifications. I need the drawing for these cars. That's called a class. So think of the class as a template or pattern for creating these objects. It is the object's type. Once I've got the pattern or the designs or the blueprints called the class, I can then develop my objects which are these cars. And each car can be a different color. It can travel at different speeds. It can have a different number of occupants in the car. But all these cars are developed from a blueprint called a class. The last thing you need is you need the correct operating system to run on your devices. So most of our development, in fact all of our development, will be happening on Mac computers, either the Mac, iMac, or a MacBook, MacBook Air, Mac Pro, any sort of Mac that you have. But you need to install the latest operating system, which is Mac OS 10.10, and it's called Yosemite, on your Mac computers. On your iOS devices like iPhones and iPads, you need the latest version of iOS, which currently is iOS 8. So I hope you have taken note of the 4 things that you require, which are your tools, your frameworks, your programming language, and what operating system you need to run on your devices. So when we get back in the next part, I will show you how to install Xcode.